One of the most emotionally evocative words in politics is anarchism. And no matter where you are on the political spectrum, that will probably bring to mind quite a rich range of concepts and ideas, and everyone has an opinion on anarchism. Some people have very strong opinions on anarchism, but what's really lacking, not just in political discourse, but also just the minds of people in general, are some real, genuine facts on what anarchism actually is. How do we take this massive, evocative, controversial, polarizing term and look at it under a microscope? How do we properly examine it and see it for what it really objectively is? So this is part of a series that I'm running on this show, Polymath, called An Objective Guide to Political Ideologies. And basically we take political science and we actually look at these ideologies for what they are. We look at them from an objective, scientific perspective. We consider economics, history, sociology, political theory, political philosophy, and by integrating all these fields, and just to let you know, I'm not just pulling answers out of my arsehole here. I'm taking the various consensus of lots of different fields in lots of different areas, and I'm integrating them all together to present to you factually what this word anarchism actually means. What is the ideology that's actually represented by anarchism? So if you're looking for an answer with no bias, no bullshit, no random hot takes spouted by some twat behind a microphone. I mean, I am a twat behind a microphone, but I'm a more informed twat behind a microphone than some of you other twats. Then, ladies and gentlemen, you've come to the right place. Welcome to Polymath. So I am your host, Daniel Levy. It is lovely to be back. I've been doing a few videos on this channel now about political ideology. So the last one was episode 14, and that was about communism. Again, a very emotionally evocative word where there's often a very vast disconnect between what most people imagine communism to be and what communism actually scientifically is. By the way, when I say scientifically here, I don't mean science as in the hard sciences. There's no chemistry of communism. It's not made of atoms. It's all intangible. But I'm talking from a social science perspective. And social sciences, things like politics, economics, anthropology, sociology, all these things which are genuine scientific disciplines and where we can have some degree of objectivity here, but where these matters ultimately exist in the minds of human beings. And anarchism, again, there's no element for anarchism existing in nature. It's an intangibility in the mind of a human being. So, I'm your host, Daniel Levy. Lovely to be here. I hope you're doing well, whoever's listening. I'm doing very well. I've been getting some new groceries lately, so yeah, things are getting pretty crazy up in here. Getting some new shapes of pasta. It's been pretty fucking wild, ladies and gentlemen. But I'm very excited to be doing a video on anarchism. This has been long overdue. I've left quite a big gap between the communism video and the anarchism video. I've been teasing you guys a little bit. I've been just been letting it mellow for a while, but it's time to get back to it. So, without further ado, what is anarchism? Let's get into it. I'm very excited. So, anarchism is a social and political philosophy, and here's the key thing to understand. Anarchism is not anarchy in the way that you understand it. Anarchism does not mean that there's no rules at all, and there's no means of enforcing those rules. It just differs with other philosophies on how those rules are formulated and how those rules are enforced. In anarchism, there's no formal legal institutions for the law, i.e. there's no institution that determines what these rules are. And there's no formal institutions that enforce these rules. There's no police force, there's no judiciary, and the key thing is there is no state. There's no government per se in anarchism. And etymologically, anarchism is just Greek for absence of government, or just without government. Now, more information on how these kind of norms work and how they're enforced later in the video. But the key thing to understand here, though, is that anarchism rejects any formal institutional enforcement of law and order, even though order is still enforced and there are still rules. So in anarchism, if there's no state, that brings us to a very important question. What is a state? And as you can imagine, there's a lot of conversation on what actually is a state. But a really solid definition is one that was actually devised by a man called Max Weber, who's a sociologist living in the 1900s. You may have heard of this guy, Max Weber. He's quite a big name. I mean, he's a big name on academics. Like, he's not like, you know what I mean? He's not like an A-list celebrity. But he's a very important figure. So his full name, Maximilian Karl Emil Weber, which I think is a pretty fucking great name. Like, if you're going to be an influential scholar, that's the name of the kind of gravity that you need. And a way to summarize the definition of a state as per the conceptualization of Max Weber, and this is a definition which is generally accepted by scholars today, is you have a differentiated set of institutions and personnel embodying centrality in the sense that political relations radiate outwards from the center to cover a territorially demarcated area of which it exercises a monopoly of authoritative binding rulemaking backed up by a monopoly of the means of physical violence. What the fuck does any of that mean? It basically means, what is a state? A state is a set of institutions and a set of people working within those institutions, and it covers a certain area, a territorially demarcated area, for example, a country. And in this area, you have a central source of authority. In the UK, for example, this is the government, this is Parliament. And from that center of authority, you have many institutions and many people representing that authority. And as you kind of go down the administrative hierarchy of a country, for example, the United Kingdom, you have smaller and smaller bodies of authority radiating outwards from that center and deriving their authority from that center until you get to very local government, like, for example, constituencies. And the key thing is that within this territorially demarcated area, this state, this form of authority, has two monopolies. One, it has a monopoly of authoritative binding rulemaking. This, for example, is a law. So anarchism is a social and political philosophy which does not do away with some form of binding rulemaking. There are still stuff you can and can't do. Like, you can't just stab someone willy-nilly. But the idea is that in the definition of a state, is it's this body which it has a monopoly of that ability within its borders. And it also, that's all backed up, that's all enforced by a monopoly of force, a monopoly of violence. So you as a private citizen cannot start your own police force and you can't start your own army. The means of physical coercion are monopolized by that state. And anarchism is a social and political philosophy which is fundamentally opposed to that state. And we're going to be going much more into the ethos of that later, but essentially the rationale of anarchism is fundamentally about liberty. It is fundamentally and deeply concerned with human freedoms, and it views any kind of state, any kind of hierarchical central authority as something which circumvents that freedom to an unacceptable degree. Now, anarchism is an ideology. What does that mean? So in this series about an objective guide to political ideologies, the key question here is, how do we define an ideology? And I talk more about this in episode 9 of Polymath. There's lots and lots of discourse about this, as you can imagine. This is a really big question. For the sake of this series, what I've done is I've taken the existing literature about this and I've tried to synthesize it in a concise, clear, and useful way that I feel represents that literature accurately and truthfully and is true to the spirit of it. So I think what it's reasonable to say, and again, this conceptualization of ideology is common in the literature, but it's not the only conceptualization. So I'm not presenting you with a word of law here. I'm presenting you with a distillation of what's out there. An ideology can be thought of as having three components: an economic component, a political component, and a social cultural component. So an ideology is a set of beliefs, a political ideology rather, is a set of beliefs which says something about A, how the economy should work and how it should be run; B, how power works, who gets power, how's it distributed, what can be done with it, what are the limits on it; and C, not social cultural views, so not just views on social issues like feminism or race rights or trans rights, etc., but also fundamental value judgments about what is good in a society. Because the kind of things which, for example, liberalism, socialism, and communism aim for are very different from the kind of things that fascism aims for. The kind of thing that liberalism, capitalist liberalism aims for is very different to the kind of things that communism aims for, etc., etc. So, and again, when we think of a key definition I have to give you first. So in each of these components of ideology, we can think of each of these components as a spectrum. And on that spectrum, an ideology can occupy a certain space on that spectrum. So in the economic component of ideology, we can conceptualize this as this one-dimensional spectrum of economic leftism versus economic rightism. And that's all about to what degree the government, or the people rather, regulate or play a role in that economy. So in economic leftism is generally is a tendency towards a greater regulation of the economy. Economic rightism is greater deregulation of the economy. The far economic right end of that spectrum is complete laissez-faire. It's complete deregulation of the economy. The far economic left end of that spectrum, we're going to explore more, but it's basically there's no markets, there's no private property. All the decisions made about economics are made by groups of individuals determining what would be good for society. And again, that's a very slapdash, simplified definition. We haven't talked a lot about that. We haven't defined many of these key terms, for example, private property. Don't worry, we're going to. This is just a very quick summary. Now, on the political component of an ideology, we have this idea of libertarianism versus authoritarianism. And it's basically the sort of power that government should have over the lives of its citizens and the nature of that power and how it's distributed. So at the far end of that spectrum, we have totalitarianism, which is when all executive power is manifested in one individual or one organization, one party, and they have, although it tends to be one individual, so like Hitler, Stalin, Kim Jong-un, etc., and they have complete power over the lives of everyone in that state. At the far end of libertarianism is actually anarchism. More on that later, but it's basically the exact opposite of that. There is no state to speak of, and no government in the sense of a state to have influence over citizens' lives. When we look at that socio-cultural component, it's a question of that socio-cultural component of ideology. I'm tripping over my words now. I'm just so excited to talk about anarchism. Jesus. Let me slow down a little bit. That socio-cultural component can be conceptualized as a spectrum of progressivism versus conservatism. Progressivism versus conservatism, different stances on issues like feminism, abortion, divorce, euthanasia, etc., but also value judgments. At the far end of the conservative spectrum, you have fascism. At the far end of the progressive spectrum, you have anarchism. More on what all of that later actually means. But the idea is that in anarchism, the ultimate aim of society is to allow the flourishing of the individual. So at the far progressive end, the values espoused, the values which are ultimately emphasized are those of liberty, individualism, freedom, and equality. At the far right end, at the far conservative end of that spectrum, we can see that the values being emphasized are authority, tradition, duty, order, and hierarchy. So again, it's really about, I've used anarchism and fascism as examples, but it's really about the values that are prevalent within a society. Now, I used the term right-wing just a few seconds ago, and that's because when we look at what left-wing and right-wing, what these terms actually mean, again, leftism and rightism, I've done an episode of it in Polymath, it's episode 8, and there's also, again, a massive political discourse on this, but I've taken that discourse, I've distilled it into a useful definition that captures that literature, and I've adapted explanations in the literature which are agreed upon by scholars. So again, I'm not pulling these definitions out of my arsehole. They're essentially just sort of simplifications of that literature. We can think of this one-dimensional axis of left-wing versus right-wing as having 3 separate components: the economic component, the political component, and the socio-cultural component. And those are the exact same components and axes that I would just mention with ideologies. So leftism is associated with economic leftism, progressivism and libertarianism. Rightism is associated with economic rightism, conservatism, and authoritarianism. And I say associated because when we talk about these terms left-wing and right-wing in modern Western parlance, that tends to be what we think of. But remember, those 3 components do not necessarily have to be bound together. So for example, fascism is hyper-authoritarianism. I can't speak. It's hyper-authoritarian. It's hyper-conservative. But it's not far economic right. In fact, it's actually fairly economically leftist. And more on the economics of fascism is something called state capitalism. I talk about that in episode 10 of Polymath. But anyway, the point is that those don't necessarily have to occur together. It's just that in colloquial speech, that tends to be what we refer to in a Western context. So what is anarchism? Anarchism, it's an umbrella term. It's an ideology, but it can occupy various different spaces on these 3 spectra, these 3 continua. But in terms of the libertarian authoritarian axis, anarchism as an umbrella occupies the furthest left spot. In terms of the progressive conservative axis, anarchism occupies the furthest left spot. In terms of the economic axis, there's a bit more spread because there are some still quite left-wing but slightly less left-wing than the furthest end of that pole variants of anarchism. But generally on that pole of on that spectrum of economic leftism versus economic anarchism, anarchism is occupying the leftmost pole and the generally fairly left areas. But again, there's more variation in that economic component, but there's also lots of variation, lots of different schools of thought in anarchism in general. Now, the point is, umbrella term, lots of different flavors, lots of different hybridizations of stuff like anarcho-collectivism, anarcho-syndicalism, anarcho-primitivism, etc., etc., etc. Now, within this kind of massive umbrella, there's a divide between schools of thought grouped together as social anarchism. and that includes anarcho-collectivism, anarcho-syndicalism, and anarcho-communism. I'm begging you, I know this is a monumentally difficult task, just pretend as if you'd never heard the word communism before, because I promise you that phrase anarcho-communism is almost definitely not what you're thinking of when you hear the word communism. Now, if you have happened to watch episode 14 of Polymath, and you know you've seen that episode on communism, which specifically you probably wouldn't have, but if you have, well done, slap on the back and a friendly kiss on the forehead, then brilliant, you will be more informed. But just for now, I'm going to get more into that big word communism later. Just ignore your preconceptions of that, I promise. So you have these schools of thought, social anarchism, and also something called mutualism, which are kind of the main school, which are kind of the main umbrella terms. You have this umbrella term, social anarchism, consisting of these three big schools of thought: anarcho-communism, anarcho-collectivism, anarcho-syndicalism. You also have mutualism. These are the main schools of thought of anarchism. Anarcho-syndicalism is arguably more of a tactic for reaching anarchism than a goal. So people who would identify as anarcho-syndicalist tend to say, my goal, the end goal of society that I conceptualize is aligned with that of either an anarcho-communist or an anarcho-collectivist. There's also another umbrella term of anarchism called individualist anarchism, where it's basically just a lot more emphasis on the primacy of the individual. But the biggest ones are anarcho-communism, anarcho-collectivism, anarcho-syndicalism, and mutualism. And what we're going to be doing in this episode is we're going to be looking at the commonalities between all these. We're going to be looking at all the kind of things that underlay both these big terms and all the various other traditions of anarchism, which I haven't named explicitly. And therefore we can kind of capture the gist of anarchism without getting into the nitty gritty of each and every one, because then we'll be here for hours. And this is already going to be a big episode. And although I hate to sacrifice that depth, I do think that it's acceptable, because I believe that even if we don't go into every tradition, you can still get a very solid idea of what anarchism actually is. You can still understand anarchism as a concept without researching each of these traditions individually. But if you want to, by all means, go ahead. Now, the key to anarchism fundamentally is this hyper-libertarian nature. And the name anarchism, which is actually originally a pejorative, applied surprisingly by Marxists, but more on that later. The name comes from the idea that the state needs to be abolished. You see, communists, the whole point of Polymath is that each episode should be comprehensible and completely understandable individually. I really, really recommend watching the communism episode though. But the idea is that a communist, and again, communism, very, very massive difference between what was done in the name of communism in the 20th century and the practices upheld by the 20th century communist states, and the theory of communism that emerged mostly in Western Europe in the 1800s, in the 19th century. The two are wildly different. I don't know of any political philosophy which has such a massive divergence between what it was meant to be and what was done in its name. But the theory of communism, as devised in the 1800s, would that be eventually you'd create a truly free and equal society where everyone would be able to truly self-actualize as an individual. Genuinely, everyone would be equal to each other. Everyone would be free to do whatever they wanted. And eventually, within this context, the idea of a state would simply wither away. There would be no need for any kind of coercive set of institutions to underpin society. So it would simply just die of its own accord. That is what communists, and again, communism, massive umbrella term, but this is the basic kind of theory of communism, is that the state would wither away over time. But the state would be used initially during a communist revolution, or during the period of the transition to communism. The state machinery would originally be used to help create a society which could then facilitate the gradual withering away of the state. Anarchists reject that. Anarchists believe that the state needs to be abolished because they fundamentally reject any form of hierarchy and any form of coercion, and the state embodies both. The idea is that instead of a state, there's not chaos. There's still institutions that govern society and create some kind of rules for society. But the idea is that instead of a state, you have lots and lots of institutions. And these institutions would be voluntary associations. You wouldn't be coerced to join any of them. They'd all be entirely democratic. These institutions could be labor unions, for example, so trade unions. There could be workers' cooperatives. A workers' cooperative is a business where the workers manage it themselves and they all get a share of the profits. It could be anything. It could be communes. It could be, it could just be some kind of ad hoc political unit. So, for example, if you look at the USSR, that stands for Union of Socialist Soviet Republics. A Soviet is just a workers' council. It's just a kind of group of workers who manage the way that they work and who manage the way that they govern themselves. And again, all this talk about workers, you might be thinking like, so is everyone working class in this scenario? The idea is that capitalism, as a consequence of the nature of capitalism, divides society between, or at least would eventually divide society between a very, very narrow elite who holds all the power and a much larger group of people who work but who don't hold real political and economic power and who aren't genuinely free. So when anarchists talk about workers' councils or workers' unions, the idea is that this would be, think of it as people's councils or people's unions. Those words aren't used. They don't say people, but the idea is that these institutions would be representative of the people as a whole. Now, that actually hasn't happened. So actually, as modernity has progressed, the middle class has gotten wider and wider and wider. But that was the kind of idea behind the anarchist philosophy. And it's the idea behind Marxist philosophy as well. That's kind of the rationale. This kind of idea of the workers representing the people here that we see in anarchism. And the idea is that all these institutions, they'd be associated with each other, they'd be in contact with each other to help kind of run this decentralized this decentralized political polity, but there wouldn't be a central authority. There wouldn't be anybody above these horizontal equal units, all kind of arranged to cooperate with each other, but never to coerce each other, but tell each other what to do. So each of these horizontal, democratic, voluntary associations would be autonomous. They roughly do their own thing. They might cooperate to set a kind of general aim, for example, foreign policy and national defense, etc., but they all work individually and they all are fundamentally democratic. Anarchism is all about liberty. It is all about each individual being free to do what they like, not to do what they like in a social sense. You can't just go around killing people and attacking people, but you can think how you like. You're not subject to any coercion or repression from a state. Now remember, if you're living in a Western liberal democracy, you are living in a very, very rare anomaly in time and space. Most of the world nowadays, and basically the entire world for the entirety of history, has involved people living under wildly oppressive states. I mean, I'll give just a random example that popped into my head now. In dynasties of China, so in the Ming and Qing dynasties of China, you'd be required to wear a certain kind of haircut to show submission to the ruling dynasty. And if you didn't wear that certain kind of haircut, you would be castrated, your barber would be castrated, all of your sons would be castrated, and your family would be exiled. The idea is that in anarchism, there's no state to tell you what to do. You still have social rules that you have to abide by, but the idea is that even in the states in Western liberal democracies are still fundamentally about coercion. You obey the state because you have to. They're still fundamentally about hierarchies. There are hierarchies within the state. There are executives. There are bureaucrats in bureaucratic hierarchies. There are police forces and police hierarchies. And also, anarchism rejects centralization. This kind of source of authority which ranks higher than you and which can tell you what to do. Anarchism is all about freedom, equality, and individualism. That's not me throwing some kind of agenda at you. It's not me saying what wishful thinking. It's not saying what I wish anarchism is. That is the goal of anarchists. The whole point of anarchism is to create a society wherein individuals can flourish as individuals and not be impeded by the need to work as wage slaves or to put money in someone else's pockets while you just survive paycheck to paycheck. The idea is that you're not reliant on having to pay rent to a landlord simply to secure the basic lease of life. The idea is that in anarchism, you create a society where all the basic goods needed for your survival are presented to you. They're given to you. There's no form of coercion, either political or economic, and that lack of any form of coercion in society. So for example, if you have to work for a boss for a shitty wage just to survive, that is coercion, and you are not truly free because you have to do that in order to survive. And if you have to do that for your whole life, that's not a very great life. The idea in anarchism is that that form of coercion is not conducive to human happiness and therefore needs to be done away with. That is a very, very broad outline of anarchism. Let's get a little bit more into it. Let's sort of delve into it a little bit more, right? Before we commence the delvation, I think, well, actually, part of that delving is getting into a little bit more about names like socialism, communism, Marxism, all these isms which are associated with anarchism. We need to untangle the word anarchism from all these other keywords because words are very meaningful in politics. Remember, politics is something that exists in people's heads. There's no chemical element for politics. There's no type of rock formation that is politics. Politics is a psychological phenomenon. It exists inside our minds. It's intangible. So words have a very powerful meaning, which means that we need to kind of examine these words in a bit more detail. So anarchism is sometimes referred to as libertarian socialism because it's part of what is the kind of general socialist movement. The socialist movement emerged in the 1800s in opposition to capitalism. And it basically said capitalism, if we look around us, is creating a very shit society which is not conducive to human happiness. What other ways of organizing a society can we come up with? And the socialist movement is this very, very broad umbrella, and it encompasses lots and lots of different terms like social democracy, socialism, anarchism, communism. Now, I've done episodes on all these phenomena. I've done episodes in all of these. Episode 12 of Polymath is about socialism. Episode 14 of Polymath is about communism. Episodes 9 and 10 talk about social democracy. And this one is about anarchism. But make no mistake. God, what is that? Make no mistake at all, gentlemen. Make no mistake. In a political science context, when we look at the political theory and philosophy behind these terms and try and extract objectivity from them, in a scientific context, socialism is not communism, communism is not anarchism, anarchism is not socialism. So that idea of it being called libertarian socialism, don't get that confused. Again, it's also sometimes called libertarian communism. This is closer to making sense, but again, communism is not anarchism. Now, here's the thing. In communism, and again, there's a massive divergence between communism in practice and communism in theory. The theory of communism is that you have a stateless society, or rather in end-stage communism. So the idea is that Marx initially said communism would progress in stages. And initially, you have workers seizing the means of production. So basically, the means of production, just stuff needed in society for other stuff to get made. So factories, land, machinery, etc. And seizing the machinery of the state. So these institutions, this monopoly on force and this machinery which characterizes the state, and using that to, quote, expropriate the expropriators. So regain the means of production from this very narrow elite of individuals who have seized it and use it to create a society where workers get back what they're owed, essentially. Where instead of working for a landlord where all their money is appropriated from them, where the fruits of their labor are appropriated from them, the gains which a worker receives is proportional to the work that they've done. And then eventually, the whole point of communism, the end goal of that, is that the state, but also nationality, sexism, family authority, social classes, money, private property, the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, class struggle, religion, ideology, markets, all of these have gone away. You have a society of free individuals who voluntarily associate with each other to kind of engage in fruitful and beneficial economic relations and political relations without an element of coercion. That's a very, very, very simplified definition of communism. Now, please watch the episode. Please do it. You don't need to watch that episode to understand this episode, but I just really recommend it because it's also a very important topic and it provides just a nice bit of background. Just a nice bit of background. Not essential background, but a nice bit of background. Now, the idea is that in anarchism, the aim here is the same. Anarchists are trying to create this goal as well. Also, by the way, it goes without saying that the communist societies in the 20th century very blatantly did not do this. They were very authoritarian, repressive societies with, to use Wikipedia's very nice euphemism, a lot of excess mortality. Yes, excess mortality. Now, communism as it was meant to be, the theory behind it as it was developed, was not meant to have this excess mortality. But the point is that anarchism is not communism. The means for creating that ideal, even though that ideal is the same, and the ethical values underpinning that ideal, so the value for liberty and human rights and freedom and equality are the same, the means to create it are different. Now, anarchism, so anarcho-communism is when you have the social, cultural, and political elements of anarchism, but the economic system is one of communism. Now, again, communism, very wide umbrella term, lots of different forms of economics in communism. The form of communism that we see in anarcho-communism, represent a specific school of communist economics. So hence anarcho-communism. So anarchism is still, even though anarcho-communism, I've said that it uses a form of communist economics, anarchism still has an economic component to it. It's still an economic phenomenon. So anarchism is still an ideology. It still has that economic component to it. Again, lots more on the nitty-gritty of the economy and how that all works later. But the point is that there are still differences between anarchism and communism. Here's another thing. Anarchism is not the same thing as Marxism. See, Marxism is this body of theory developed by Karl Marx, and it's a way of conceptualizing history, the economy, and the society. It's a way of looking at the world. And it's a way of looking at how that world has changed and the laws to which the world changes and the laws to which capitalist society works by and what that's eventually going to lead to. Now, again, not all forms of communism are actually Marxist, but the vast majority of communism is Marxist. It uses that theoretical Marxist underpinning. Now, anarchism has often been influenced by Marxism, but it's not the same. And there's a lot of divergences. So first of all, anarchism does not accept something called historical materialism. Historical materialism is this Marxist way of conceptualizing history. And historical materialism is basically saying like the political and cultural superstructure of a society. So the ideas that they have, this kind of libertarian authoritarian axis, the social cultural axis, that component, it's just a superstructure. It's something that comes up as a result of the economic relations between society, the economic relations within a society. So for example, in hunter-gatherer societies, or in feudal societies, or in capitalist societies, the economic relations, i.e. the way that stuff is made, is very, very different. So the set of ideas and concepts in these societies, consequentially, is also very different as well. And the key thing in historical materialism is that in each, you have these stages of global development. So we started out as hunter-gatherers. We then developed into these classical societies which used slave labor, had a very large force of slave labor. That then developed into feudal societies. That then developed into capitalistic societies. And that eventually will develop into communist societies or socialist societies. And the idea behind historical materialism is that that transition is inevitable. That is a law of history. And it's inevitable because capitalism contains... So there's a philosopher called Hegel, which Marx kind of drew heavily from, but also kind of not misinterpreted, but kind of twisted Hegel's original thing. And the idea is, there's something called Hegelian dialectics, which is the idea that the way that Marx uses this idea is that in something like capitalism, for example, you have these kind of mutually antagonistic elements. So this kind of conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, which always have opposing interests. One wants to exploit the other wants to avoid being exploited, and that inherent contradiction cannot be solved. And eventually that contradiction will lead to the creation of a stateless communist society wherein there will be heaven on earth and peace and harmony, and the end of this series of contradictions that we see within each stage of historical development. Now, anarchism does not accept that. Anarchists do not necessarily take historical materialism as valid. Marxism is very classic for talking about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, these two key social classes, but it also massively underemphasizes other social classes. So, for example, the peasantry. So for the vast majority of human history, most of mankind has lived and worked in the countryside. So rates of urbanization are high now. Nowadays, most people live in cities and kind of act as workers in an industrial economy. That was not the case for the vast majority of human civilization, which began at around the 4th millennium BC, around 4000 BC to 3400 BC, depending on the date that you want to use. The vast majority of people were individuals working agriculturally on the land, rurally, in the countryside. And Marx doesn't really talk about that a lot. He also doesn't talk a lot about what he calls the lumpen proletariat, a kind of underclass of people without any secure employment or secure wages. Now, in modern economic parlance, this is known as the precariat. So anarchists basically say, well, hold on, it's not wise to view society as this kind of monolith of two classes that neglect everything else. And in fact, a region in the West, Spain, where anarchism was most popular, can perhaps be explained by the fact that Spain was, at least during the 1900s and the 1800s, one of the least urbanized areas of Western Europe. So you could understand that a social and political philosophy, which actually talks about the peasantry and acknowledges their importance, you can see how that kind of philosophy would be more popular comparatively there than in other locations. Also, the idea is that in Marxism, the idea is that the ruling elite is the bourgeoisie, it's class-bound. In anarchism, the idea of anarchism is that the ruling elite doesn't necessarily have to be the bourgeoisie. So if you're the proletariat and you start a revolution, you overthrow the bourgeoisie, and you then seize the reins of power, you seize the machinery of the state, you seize the means of production, you've become the new ruling class. No matter what your original class was, the idea of the ruling elite, it's not bound to being a specific social class per se. It's just a group of individuals who happen to control society. There's also the fact that Marxism tends to see lots of other oppression movements, for example, women's rights, for example, or the oppression of different races and civil rights for minorities in relation to class, and it sees them as kind of supplementary to this overarching class struggle. Anarchism accepts all oppression movements as equally legitimate and equally important. But again, I mean, there's some commonalities between Marxism and anarchism, but anarchism is not something that's been based off of Karl Marx in the same way that communism has. And in fact, historically, there's been quite a bit of conflict with Marxists and anarchists. So in the first International, so there's this organization called the International Working Men's Association. And it was founded in 1864, I do believe. Yeah, it was 1864. It was founded in 1864. And it was this massive political international of left-wing groups, so social democrats, socialists, communists, anarchists, and all meant to be talking about the situation in Europe, the working class struggle, opposition to capitalism, that kind of atmosphere. And in that, there was actually a lot of disagreements between the Marxist faction, led by Karl Marx, and the anarchist faction, led by this Russian anarchist called Bakunin. And actually, in 1872, Bakunin and his followers were kicked out by Marxists because there was lots of conflict. And in fact, Marxists initially used the word anarchist as a pejorative term, so as an insult to talk about Bakunin and his followers, the Bakuninites. And then it was just eventually adopted by the movement. Similarly to how Tory and Whig were originally used as pejoratives, and then these political movements in the 1800s began to adopt them as the names of these political movements. The idea is that Bakunin, the Bakunites, basically understood that as long as you have any kind of teachings which accept authority and hierarchy and centrality in any kind of form, that would eventually lead to authoritarianism. So, classically, Marxism believes in a concept called the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, that is not a dictatorship of a party, by the way. That is a dictator. It refers to a class of society, the proletariat, and according to Marxist theory, the proletariat would eventually occupy 95% plus of society. So the idea is that the dictatorship of the proletariat is like the dictatorship of the people. What that means is that although the bourgeoisie would previously hold political power in Western societies, in Marxist theory, the proletariat would take that over and seize the means of production and the machinery of the state from the bourgeoisie and establish a dictatorship of their class, the proletariat, over the bourgeoisie. However, there would still very much be democracy within the proletariat. It's not an actual dictatorship. It just refers to the predominance of one class and the primacy of that social class, the proletariat, in society. But anarchists saw that and they said, well, listen, if you have a group of people and they take power of the state, even if they were originally workers, if they're originally part of the proletariat, what's to stop them from then using the machinery of that state to then establish another authoritarian regime? As soon as you give a group of people power corrupts, and they can use it for nefarious ends. So even though anarchists and Marxists both want a stateless society, anarchists say you cannot use the state, i.e. hierarchy, coercion, authoritarianism, to establish that stateless society, because if you do, you're not going to get there, because people can use that for their own means, which, by the way, is exactly what happened. So all of these 20th century movements, the reason for this massive divergence in communist practice and communist theory is because you have a group of people. A great example is the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks seize power in the USSR, grab hold of that state machinery, hold one election, lose, declare it invalid, establish a secret police, and then establish a brutal dictatorship. So, Bakunin and the anarchists were actually correct in this case, but at the time, Marxists didn't think so. So Bakunin thought that Marxist communism, was an inherently authoritarian ideology. Now, again, in its actual form, according to that communist theory, it's not actually an authoritarian ideology. It's a highly libertarian ideology. It still very much emphasizes the freedom and the agency of the individual and opposes the abolition of a capitalist state because it sees capitalism as fundamentally coercive, i.e., if you have to work for a boss in order to survive, if you have to be exploited in order to survive, and you're just living day to day, you are not free. It's worth pointing out that the form of capitalism that was going on when all of this opposition emerged is very different to the form of capitalism now. So in the early Industrial Revolution, the early 1800s, in Britain, for example, you'd have people working 16 hours a day. People would be crammed into minuscule houses, stuff 5 people into a single bed. So you didn't even, no one having your own house, no one having your own room. You didn't even have your own bed. You'd all be dying of cholera and horrible preventable diseases because all the dwellings would be so unsanitary and crowded and grim. You'd get your arm torn off by a machine and you wouldn't get any compensation or help from it, so you'd just die in the streets because no one else would hire you. It was a very grim society. So the idea of this vicious opposition to capitalism, this conceptualization of capitalism as something that isn't free, that's the kind of context that it grew up in. But it's still, the anarchists would say that's still valid today. Even in Western liberal democracy, there are plenty of people who either cannot make ends meet or have to work 2 jobs to make ends meet, or fundamentally have to work a job that they despise in order to make ends meet. And if you have to do that, then you're not free. But the idea is that in communism, you are free from that. So communism is meant to be a libertarian ideology. You're meant to be free from both political and economic coercion in communism. It's meant to be democratic. In practice, it very much was not democratic. Unsurprisingly, the USSR actually made anarchism illegal. There was actually a protest in the early days of the USSR, and around about 1921, there was this big movement, the Kronstadt movement, where a bunch of sailors and soldiers basically rebelled against the government, and they wanted rights, basically. They just wanted their civil rights, and the government massacred them. So, again, very, very different to what communism was meant to be. Communism was meant to be the ultimate guarantee of everyone's individual liberties and rights, free from coercion. Wasn't quite that in practice. So, basically, the idea is anarchism creating opposition to capitalism, because the idea is that capitalism generates a huge amount of suffering and is not conducive to the human happiness, to the happiness of the society. Despite this, there is actually a movement called anarcho-capitalism, which basically combines the socio-cultural and political aspects of anarchism with the economic system of capitalism. This is a view that is advocated by people. It's not really seen as legitimate or valid in the rest of the anarchism movement, especially as the whole point of anarchism is that it emerged in opposition to the brutalities of capitalism. The whole point of anarchism is that it sees capitalism as an insufficient means of establishing the aims of anarchism. To create a truly free, authorityless society, you can't have capitalism doing that because capitalism leads to authority differentials. For example, employee and employer. It's not really seen as valid at all. I don't think the consensus amongst anarchists is that anarcho-capitalism is not a true form of anarchism, but it is a viewpoint that exists, and I want to bring your attention to that. Anarcho-capitalists don't see themselves as libertarian socialists or libertarian communists. They see themselves as individualist anarchists. Remember how I talked about individualist anarchism earlier as this kind of school of thought emphasizing the primacy of the individual? That's kind of how they see themselves. I do recommend doing a little bit more research on it, but it's not seen as truly part of the anarchist movement. Now, what I think is an important thing to address is the association that people have of anarchism with things like terrorism and violence. So what is the view of anarchism to violence? What are the means by which an anarchist society should be created? So anarchists genuinely believe that to establish anarchism, a revolution of some kind is needed. Political systems that exist nowadays will not willingly lead to anarchist societies. So socialism, for example, has reformist and revolutionary currents. Communism is essentially a revolutionary phenomenon. The same thing with anarchism. But the question is, how do we get there? To what degree is violence needed? There's lots of disagreement between different flavors of anarchism. There's lots of different approaches. There's also been lots of change over time in views of violence and the uses of violence. Some basic principles that all anarchists hold: any kind of mass violence, regardless of the point of said violence, is unacceptable. For example, the Great Leap Forward in Maoist China, where tens of millions of people died in order to create a communist society, or the mass purges adopted by Stalin, or the genocides committed in communist states in the 20th century, like, for example, that of Pol Pot in Cambodia, where I think a third of the population were massacred. Any kind of mass violence, regardless of the aim, is always rejected. Any kind of violence against random individuals are also not tolerated. Violence can only be employed in any kind of anarchist theory, regardless of who you ask, against individuals employed in oppression in some way. So, for example, well, I'll give an example later, actually. I'm going to get onto that later. There are some, by the way, strains of anarchism, such as anarcho-pacifism, which reject any kind of violence. Again, there's a lot of disagreement and diversity here. Now, when anarchists employ violence against individuals who are employed in oppression, they can get labeled as terrorists. Now, the definition of a terrorist really massively varies. Generally, the general consensus definition is that it's someone who uses violence against non-combatants for political aims. So, depending on the target of an anarchist individual engaging in violence, depending on what level of the legitimacy by which you could say that individual is a combatant, depending on that definition, you could reasonably call certain anarchists or anarchist groups terrorist, specifically, especially historically as well, not so much now. So anarchist groups like Antifa, for example, they haven't known to engage in violence. So, I mean, there is debate on whether these are classed as terrorist organizations, but they tend not to. There's been much of an emphasis away from terrorism as an anarchist tactic. But the idea is that this violence or terroristic violence is used only against individuals who are carrying out oppression. So I'm going to use an example. So this classically happened in Russia in the late 1800s. So when I talk about anarchistic terrorism, and again, terrorist, very loaded word. The idea is just that these anarchists in the late 1800s were engaged in violence against the machinery of the state, which they perceived to be oppressive, and they were willing to use violence to do that. It's worth noting that these individuals often had the support of their societies against the machinery of the state. So I'm going to give an example. There's a very famous Russian anarchist called Vera Zazilish. She was a Russian kind of activist around the late 1800s. She actually died in 1919, but she was active in the late 1800s. And she assassinated an individual called Colonel Fyodor Trepov. So Colonel Fyodor Trepov was this colonel in Russia, and he was Russia at the time had annexed Poland. The Poles obviously wanted their own state, free of Russia just oppressing the piss out of them. And I recommend looking up Russian treatment of Poland during the 1800s. It's not wonderful. And there were some Polish rebellions in 1830 and 1863, which the Russians, and particularly Fyodor Trepov, played quite a large role in this. Very violent, brutal, quite atrocious suppression of these rebellions. And there was a political prisoner in 1879, some guy called Arkhip Bogolyubov. That's it. It's always a bit of it challenges me a little bit sometimes pronouncing Russian surnames. I'm very, very apologetic to any Russians. Arkhip Bogolyubov, if you happen to be listening, I'm very, very sorry. I did get it in the end, though. We're nailing it now. No, so Bogolyubov refused to remove his cap in the presence of Trepov. Trepov, in response to this slight, this kind of show of disrespect, had him publicly flogged, which outraged not only actual revolutionaries and left-wings and kind of leftists, but also just the intelligentsia in general. So, kind of anyone who'd been university educated, for example. So, by the way, when I say that anarchism evolved in opposition to states and hierarchy and authority, for the vast majority of human history, this is what authority was. It was you had some representative of the state, no matter how brutal or bloody they'd been, no matter how much they'd oppressed members of your own family even, if you didn't show submission to them, you'd be publicly humiliated and injured by the agent of the state. So Zashlish shot him. She was tried, and the jury actually found her not guilty. So they were kind of on her side there, and she became a bit of a hero to populists and the kind of radical wing of Russian society. So and there's been lots of other examples of that, by the way. So another example is how anarchists tried to assassinate Henry Clay Frick, who is this individual in Gilded Age America who is very famous for. So basically, Frick was, I believe, the labor manager for Andrew Carnegie. And when workers went on strike against Carnegie Steelworks for pretty bad conditions, Frick hired a mercenary group, the Pinkertons, to basically shoot them down in the streets. And in response to him using this violence to just gunning down people who were essentially striking for just decent working conditions, I recommend looking up the story again. The striking was pretty fair if you look up the way that they were being treated. Very fair if you look at the way they were treated, actually. So anarchists tried to assassinate Henry Clay Frick, for example. The idea is that anarchists did try to use assassinations and bombings, but only on certain people, only on people who were deemed to be active in oppression in some kind of way. This kind of use of terroristic violence stopped at around about World War I. Nowadays, anarchists overwhelmingly go for direct action. So direct action, a very large range of tactics, kind of varies from protests to industrial sabotage, sometimes clashes against police, violence against police and fascists and racists. Now, this has also led to individuals being labelled as terrorists. So, for example, there was this group of people in France. I'm just going to find a bit more information about it, called the Tarnac Nine. There are these group of French anarchists, these 9-year-old individuals, and they were sabotaging electrical telegraph lines, and they were labelled as terrorists for doing so, and they were punished for it, essentially. Now, that label of them as terrorists, you can imagine, the idea is that they had terroristic motivations. Based on the consensus definition of terrorism, I'll lead you to decide whether that constitutes terrorism reasonably or not. Again, I mean, it's up to you. I'm not trying to tell you what to think. I'm just trying to present facts to you. But the idea is that any kind of anarchist action is done through these small voluntary associations where there's no formal hierarchy, there's no leaders, there's no authority, and these small kind of cells, these small associations work horizontally to each other. They coordinate with each other, but they are generally autonomous. There's no central authority telling them what to do. Anarchist groups, I think a big reason why anarchism is seen as especially anarchist groups like Antifa, these are such emotionally evocative names in societies, especially because lots of politicians tend to use these as a boogeyman in order to serve their own political goals. So, for example, I talk about this in episode 16, which is basically how democracies elect dictators, but it also talks about how, especially in the West at the moment, we're seeing a surgence in populist authoritarianism. So political groups and parties who basically claim to be anti-establishment and claim to be kind of speaking for the little guy, but who also said the existing political system isn't working in some way and that they need to step in and fix it in some way. So examples of this, that's a really slapdash generalization definition of it, but just some examples: Bolsonaro, Modi, Trump, Netanyahu, Orban, etc., etc. And these individuals, again, what I talk about in episode 16 is that any kind of authoritarian figure, even though they don't necessarily want to be a dictator, but these populist authoritarians are by definition authoritarian figures. They wish to consolidate power in some way. In order to do that, the psychological mechanisms needed to do that are to generate some kind of threat. They need to have some kind of outgroup. What I mean by an outgroup, I mean in psychology, human beings tend to engage in in-group, out-group thinking, in this kind of dichotomous us versus them system of thought. And you see it in politics, you see it in religion, you see it in nationality, you see it in football teams. The human brain has an innate capacity to do that for reasons that make sense evolutionarily, that I'm not going to go into. But the point is that once you designate someone as an out-group, you feel threatened by them and you lose empathy towards them. It's much more easier to devalue and dehumanize them. And what populist authoritarians try to do, any kind of authoritarian figure in general, whether either left-wing or right-wing, they will try and find some kind of outgroup. In the modern West, this outgroup is immigrants. In the 1930s, it was Jews and Bolsheviks. You find some kind of outgroup and present them as a threat. And often multiple outgroups will be found. So, for example, in the United States of America, Antifa and immigrants tend to be demonized as an outgroup, and Antifa is presented as this sort of threat. And by doing that, by presenting a threat, it encourages cohesion and loyalty to the in-group, i.e. individuals who are not Antifa. It gives authority to the leader, because the idea is that a leading political figure can then say, okay, this is a threat, I am going to take care of this threat. Trust in me, give me moral authority and legitimacy, and I will take care of this threat, and I am needed to take care of this threat. That's, again, a very big slapdash generalization of political psychology. Please watch episode 16. Well, that sounds very desperate, doesn't it? Guys, please watch episode 16. Please. I recommend doing it. It's a good episode. If I do say so myself. The point is that anarchist groups like Antifa are very excellent boogeymen to use, regardless of their levels of violence. And in fact, the vast majority of violent terrorism and domestic extremism you see is committed either by Islamist groups or by far right-wing groups. So, for example, the EDL riots this summer were a really classic example of that. But if you actually look at British or Western counterintelligence agencies, these agencies' suspicions and models are geared towards and kind of targeted towards far-right and Islamist groups, and the targeting of Islamist groups in itself has generated a lot of controversy. The far-right thing has only come in much more recently. So the British counter-terrorism strategy, which is known as the contest strategy, what's the word? Immediately? No. In the beginning. What the fuck is the word? Initially! It's fucking initially! Oh my god. Wow. I'm losing brain cells by the minute, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, initially. So it initially targeted only Islamist groups, but after a while, and after lots of criticism, it expanded it to kind of target far-right extremist groups as well. And nowadays, counterintelligence agencies are on the lookout for far-right extremism. But yes, the point is that Antifa and anarchist groups, despite committing less actual terrorism and violence, are a very good bogeyman. A groove man, they're a dance man, they're a better dance man, they're a better, I don't know what I'm talking about, guys, I'm starting to lose it. They're a better boogeyman to use. So, we've been spending a lot of time giving a kind of broad outline of anarchism, talking about the kind of general aims of it and how it interacts with all these other isms, and how it relates to violence as well. Let's analyze anarchism in terms of these three ideological components: political, economic, and social-cultural. So let's talk about political as well. So this kind of libertarian authoritarianism spectrum. So the defining feature of anarchism is that it is a hyper-libertarian ideology. In this axis of libertarian authoritarianism, the anarchist umbrella encompasses the leftmost pole of that spectrum. Anarchism is the ultimate egalitarian philosophy. One of its crucial key moral values is equality. It rejects any kind of power, any kind of hierarchy, any kind of social classes, even autocratic religions. So, for example, Abrahamic religions, because they designate a figure of authority which has to be obeyed, where there is a moral imperative to obey that figure of authority, and wherein that authority uses coercion to secure obedience, i.e. the idea of hell. There's also no kind of superiors. There's no workplace superiors. There's no family superiors, for example. So there's no paternalistic authority of the father over the rest of the family, etc., etc. The divergence with Marxism and anarchism is due to, as I mentioned, the total rejection of any authority or any kind of hierarchy, even for the revolution, even for revolutionary purposes, even as a transitionary measure. So again, the value system of anarchism, it's one which fundamentally talks about equality and liberty, and it also talks about empathy, which we'll get a little bit more about later. When I say these kind of values, by the way, there's an excellent theory called moral foundations theory that we see in political psychology. And I say theory, that's not the same as a hypothesis, it's not the same as a prediction. A theory is a model of perceiving the world based on evidence. And moral foundations theory is a theory which is growingly becoming a consensus in psychology. And there's arguably already a consensus. That's the only reason why I'm presenting it to you. It's accepted generally as valid already, which basically says that which basically posits that the political judgments that we make, it's not based on kind of rational weighings up of certain policies, and we kind of have an intuitive understanding of that anyway. People are not rational in politics. Like, have you ever tried to change someone's mind in a political discussion? It's really fucking difficult. The idea is that actually the bases of people's political beliefs and values are based on innate moral values that human beings are born with, and there are networks in the human brain which correspond to recognition of these innate moral foundations. And there are 7 of these moral foundations. One of these is empathy. People care about other people's suffering. So people dislike cruelty. Another one is equality. For example, the idea of people being the same. For example, if I randomly said that I'm better than you, you wouldn't like that. That would be seen as immoral. It would be seen as immoral if, for example, you have, like in North Korea, for example, there's a very narrow elite and there's a very vast mass of individuals who are oppressed by said elite, and that's unfair both for empathy reasons and for equality reasons. There's proportionality, the idea of people getting back what they're owed. So, for example, if I took away loads of your money and gave it to a random person, that would be immoral. There's authority. Now, authority, the way that people apply this is very different, but what I'm trying to say is that the idea of authority being an innate moral foundation, for example, a kid being really disrespectful to his parents for no reason, most people would find that immoral. Most people have a conception of legitimate authority where it is moral to obey them. Some people define that in different ways than others. So certain individuals may define legitimate authorities as just whichever political figure they're currently idolizing. Most people don't do that. Another moral foundation is loyalty. People dislike treachery and betrayal. Another moral foundation is sanctity. And this is something that in modern Western politics we don't have a very strong conception of, but you do see it in Western conservatives. So, for example, when Americans dislike you burning the flag or treading on the flag, That's an idea of sanctity. You're taking something which is kind of seen as like a sacred symbol and disrespecting it. People dislike that. Another example would be like peeing on a temple, for example. That's just like a really random example I can think of. But if you like walked inside a church and just peed on the floor, even if no one noticed that or knew about it, most people would still find that immoral. Another thing is incest. Most people find incest as just inherently immoral, even if it's consensual and doesn't impair the relationship between two people. And finally, a moral foundation is liberty. People like freedom. Now again, different individuals have different political beliefs because they emphasize these foundations in different ways, and they view the scope of these foundations in different ways. So a fascist, for example, would have a very different balance of these foundations, and a very different the way in which these foundations are expressed would be very different than for another individual. So for anarchists, the moral values underpinning that anarchist system are classically empathy, equality, and liberty. So it's fundamentally democratic anarchism. Any anarchist formulation is always going to be democratic. And the idea is that rather than being a representative democracy, anarchists favor direct democracy. So rather than you electing some guy who holds political power on your behalf, you as an individual exercise that political power directly. So the idea is that anarchism is composed of these horizontal associated institutions, and within each of these institutions, within each of these, so communes or networks or councils or unions or whatever, you as an individual vote and make decisions on what that institution does. And the idea is that society is this confederation of these communes, and they mutually help each other. They help each other freely. They're not coerced into doing so. The idea is that humans are not inherently... There is no rule that humans would be too greedy and selfish to do this. There's lots of criticism on anarchism having a very utopian view of human nature. So the idea is that, for example, that greed is is not innate in human beings, but is a result of capitalistic living. Greed is innate in human beings. We can even conjecture on the evolutionary purpose of having an emotion like greed. But the idea is, but it's also found that greed can be expressed in different ways based on people's environments, and people make decisions acting on greed or ignoring greed in different ways based on their local environments. So that's not necessarily a refutation of anarchism, but again, it is one of the big criticisms of anarchism, that all this is a bit utopian and that people need some degree of coercion. But the idea also behind anarchism is that it's fundamentally very individualist. The idea is that this society is structured so that you aren't a member of like a big social class which is bound up with your identity. So for example, if you live in the caste system in India and you're an untouchable, that's your identity. No one gives a shit about who you are as an individual. Your identity is bound up with your social class. Anarchism is the biggest and most fundamental rejection of that. It says that your identity should be bound up with you as an individual, and society should be structured in a way that allows you as an individual to have the maximum leisure time, the maximum creativity, and the maximum self-development. You shouldn't be forced to work in a society in which like a shitty dead-end job which kills your creativity and doesn't realize your potential. Now again, more on the economics of anarchism later, and again, it's a valid criticism that there will always be work in a society which perhaps individuals don't want to do, which nevertheless has to be done. So it's also worth saying that in communism, Marx himself wanted a kind of bottom-up revolution. So they did like the people rising up spontaneously and associating and creating institutions to seize power. But some variants of communism advocate a top-down approach to communism. So for example, a revolutionary party, a kind of revolutionary vanguard, this organized, disciplined, hierarchical, centralized political party, seizing power and then using the reins of the power, using the reins of state machinery to create communism. So for example, Lenin is a classic example of someone who advocated a top-down approach to communism. Marx advocated the bottom-up approach. Anarchists, the whole point of anarchism is that to establish anarchism or any kind of libertarian socialism, any kind of anti-capitalist socialist umbrella change, it has to be through a bottom-up approach. It has to be of the people en masse, voluntarily associating with each other, forming these voluntary institutions which are not hierarchical, which work together to achieve the common goal. It cannot come from from a kind of authoritarian hierarchical body which then seizes power on behalf of the people, because when that happens, that inevitably just leads to more authoritarianism, which in fact is exactly what happened pretty much. It's also worth saying that Bakunin, the anarchist that I mentioned earlier, said, "We are convinced that freedom without socialism is privilege and injustice, and that socialism without freedom is slavery and brutality." So socialism without freedom, essentially what he means is all these 20th century communist governments. Obviously, he wasn't referring to them specifically. He wouldn't have known about them, but that is what he would have dubbed them as. So, and the idea is that anarchism itself, so Kropotkin actually, another nice definition of anarchism is the idea of the no government system of socialism. So you have both socialism and freedom, but that freedom is only possible without government. If you have the state, if you have the government, then freedom cannot be possible. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's no rules. It's not a social chaos. It's not a kind of return to the law of the jungle, kill or be killed. The idea is just that order is not maintained by a state, a judiciary, a professional police force, a book of laws. The means by which order is maintained in different anarchist philosophies is sometimes unclear, and there's no kind of big consensus on how it would be done. Most anarchists tend to gravitate towards a solution of sort of volunteer communal police militias, things like that. So individuals who can choose to engage in policing functions without being a professional member of the police. So without there being a formal institution for a police force, without there being people whose job it is to be the police, but rather individuals can either choose to be and or be elected as kind of individuals responsible for enforcing laws, and who do that not as a full-time job, but as an additional function. Another idea of kind of maintaining order is that and we see this especially in the provision of economics, which we're going to talk about, the idea of social dynamics regulating people's behavior rather than formal institutional law. So in hunter-gatherer societies, for example, there's no law, there's no illegal institutions, there's no army, there's no police force, there's no judiciary. The way that hunter-gatherers maintain social norms amongst their populations is by social dynamics. So, for example, if someone acts in a particularly inappropriate way, they are shunned or ostracized or criticized, depending on the degree of defense, by the community, and that helps rectify action. Now, the hunter-gatherer approach does actually work. So, hunter-gatherer societies do, even though they don't have formal institutions, they do still manage to regulate their societies and enforce adherence to social norms. The difficulty is applying that to society in a larger degree. However, the division in anarchists of society into lots of different horizontal, individual autonomous units may be conducive towards that, because it's shown that humans as individuals can maintain up to about 150 social relations at once. So hunter-gatherer societies don't exceed 150. And in this kind of small-scale environment, social sanctions can be effective in encouraging adherence to norms, but then also the effectiveness of that in a hunter-gatherer population is not when kind of survival is a much more pressing need and ostracism and isolation basically means death. The dynamic of that may not be present in an anarchist society, so it's difficult to say whether social dynamics and social punishments rather than legal punishments may have the same effects. It's a bit of a different anarchist thinkers will sort of say different things on just how a form of order is to be maintained. And also if there's no prison, then how is justice to be conducted? What happens to offenders? The general stint is towards restorative or rehabilitative justice. But again, there's not much of a firm consensus on the mechanism of how all this would really work. And different kind of anarchist thinkers and groups advocate for different solutions. I'm not reporting anything concrete to you because it doesn't seem to be a concrete consensus in this kind. But it seems like the emphasis is on communal volunteer police, the idea of everyone being involved in exercising justice, through being able to join said police, and through being able to enforce social dynamics, and the idea of justice being restorative and rehabilitative. Now, that kind of talks about how political power is conceptualized and deployed in anarchism. Let's move on to the economic component of anarchism. So how does the economy work in anarchism? Now, there's lots of different variations of anarchist economics, but anarchist economics is still a thing. There is an economic philosophy of anarchism. So when we look at that spectrum of economic leftism versus economic rightism, we see the umbrella of anarchism occupying the left end of that spectrum. And the furthest end of that umbrella is at the very leftmost pole of that spectrum. And that's anarcho-communism. Now, anarcho-communism, again, as I said, the word communism, very emotionally evocative, very decisive. I'm going to explain what that is for the purposes of this context. So anarcho-communism is the socio-political philosophy of anarchism coupled with the economic system of communism. I'm going to explain what the economic system of communism is in a bit. For the sake of this, I really recommend watching episode 14 of Polymath, which just talks about what communism actually is. For the sake of this episode, please just forget about the word communism. Just pretend, try and eliminate the pre-associations you have with that word, because they're probably not going to be accurate. Not that I'm calling you stupid. I think you're very, very clever. I think you're lovely, actually. But in terms of political science perspective, simply because the word communism is so evocative and polarizing, and there's so much information about it, your ideas about the word communism probably aren't going to correspond to how the economics of communism actually works. So just try and cleanse your mind of any preconceptions regarding that. So at the furthest end of that economic left-wing, economic right-wing spectrum, we have anarcho-communism. In the furthest right of that umbrella term of anarchism is something called mutualistic anarchism. But again, that's still objectively a very economically left-wing policy. The idea is that there's different varieties of anarchism and different varieties of way that the economy works in anarchism. So we have anarcho-communism, anarcho-collectivism, and anarcho-syndicalism. These are three schools of thought, although sometimes anarcho-syndicalism is taken not as a distinct form of anarchist economics, but more of a tactic, more of a way to reach the end goal of anarcho-communism or anarcho-collectivism or whatever. And these three anarchos are grouped under this umbrella of social anarchism. There's another form of anarchist economics called mutualism, which is grouped under another umbrella called individualist anarchism. So these are the main forms of anarchist economics. But all these different forms of anarchist economics share some very key underlying principles. And this is what makes anarchist economics a valid term. It's what makes an economic philosophy that is anarchism. So the key thing of anarchism is that there is no private property. Private property refers to private ownership of the means of production. Right. What does all of that mean? So private property and the means of production are not socialist or communist or Marxist terms. They're just general economic terms. Now, the means of production is just how things get made in an economy. So the means of production includes labor, the instruments of labor, so tools, factories, infrastructure, buildings used for production, etc., and the subjects of labor, so natural resources, raw materials, land. The idea is that labor acts on the subjects of labor using the instruments of labor to create goods. And ownership of any of these components is private property. Private property is not the same thing as personal property. Personal property is stuff that you use for yourself. So that's stuff like your clothes, your furniture, your food, your toothbrush, etc. Private property is stuff that is used to make other things. So another way of conceptualizing the means of production is something called the three factors of production, which is land, labor, and capital. Capital is just resources. It also includes things like capital goods, which is goods which are used to make other goods. So machinery, for example, is a capital good. It's distinguished from consumer goods. So the means of production, it often colloquially includes the means of distribution, but it's not technically the same. So the means of distribution is just how stuff that gets made gets distributed. So how do you actually get that stuff out? So stores, infrastructure, the internet, that's means of distribution. Now, in any form of anarchist economics, there cannot be any private ownership of the means of production or means of distribution. So these things cannot be owned by individuals and operated for the sake of profit. The idea is, pardon me, how very rude. The idea is that in anarchism, oh goodness, my stomach clearly has an issue with anarchist economics, or maybe it's in favor of anarchist economics. I don't know. I can't tell you the political orientation of my stomach. Anyway, so the idea is that in anarchism, there has to be communal ownership. Or rather, well, not necessarily communal ownership. I'm actually going to get to that in a bit. But rather, there is no private property. There is no private ownership of the means of production. Another key thing in anarchist economics is that there's no wage labor. So an idea, to quote a very famous anarchist by the name of Proudhon, he says, "Do you know what it is to be a wage worker? It is to labor under another, watchful for his prejudices even more than for his orders. It is to have no mind of your own, to know no stimulus save your daily bread and the fear of losing your job. The wage worker is a man to whom the property owner who hires him says, 'What you are to do is to be none of your business. You have nothing to control in it.'" The idea is that wage labor results in exploitation. So private property results in wage labor because some people need to operate said means of production, although they're not actually gaining the fruit of their own labor. They're just being given a wage, and wage labor is fundamentally exploitative and unfair. And private property, when individuals operate the means of production for their own personal profit rather than the goods of society as a whole, that is immoral, and that is not how society should be run. That is the idea of anarchism. Now, and again, another really, really nice quote from Proudhon. He believes that the labourer retains, even after he has received his wages, a natural right in the thing he has produced. Again, that's another very important thing. It's another very important kind of economic tenet of anarchism. So in terms of anarchism, instead of having sort of property rights, you have things like use rights. So if you are using something, if you're engaging in it, so if you're a worker and you work in a coal mine, you may be under different kind of schools of thought of anarchism. And some of these schools of thought of anarchism, you have a right to the fruits of your produce in terms of that. However, if you are not actively using something, so for example, if you have land but you're not using that for anything, in no aspect of anarchism do you have any kind of right to that land. So in any conception of anarchism, stuff that's seen as your possession, for something to be seen as your possession, you have to be actively using it. Another thing, in any form of anarchism, there is a collective access to land, but also just a collective access to anything needed for life. So stuff like housing and shelter, for example, if it's needed, it cannot be, you can't restrict people's access to it based on economic purposes. There has to be a universal, fair access to that. Another really classic thing you have in anarchism is the idea of a democratic workplace, or a republic of the workplace, you could say. So in a workplace, there's no hierarchy, there's no orders, there's no control. People make their own decisions collectively about what is done. And again, if there's minorities in that consensus, they still have to acquiesce to that consensus. It's not as if you can literally do whatever you want. But the point is that what is to be done is determined by the community of the workplace. There's also, so the idea is like, you have workers' control over the workplace. To quote Proudhon again, he's a very quotable man. You have little republics of workers, and each little republic of the worker it's kind of free, voluntary association of men and women, whether on the land, whether in a factory, whether in a mine, whether in an office. Each of them themselves manage production. So you have these lots of voluntary associations, and the economic society, the kind of basis of society is that you have this free federation, or rather confederation, of these associations without any kind of central authority. So that's the kind of basic gist of anarchism. But as you can see, all of this is fundamentally opposed to the system of capitalism. The idea that is that capitalism will fundamentally lead, it's fundamentally unfair to charge people for basic needs, to force people to be wage laborers, to force people in general to spend their lives engaged in economic activity that they don't want to do, or that doesn't benefit them, or that they're forced in some way to do, whether directly by a manager telling you what to do, or indirectly by the fact that you have to work to survive. The idea is that that is fundamentally unfair. So, let's go and explore some kind of specific kinds of anarchist economics. So the first big one is anarcho-communism. So what is anarcho-communism? Anarcho-communism is, so remember when you have an ideology, there are three components to any ideology, as we've discussed. The economic component, the political component, and the socio-cultural component. So in anarcho-communism, you have the socio-cultural and the political philosophy of anarchism, but you couple it with an economic system of communism. So, what is the economic system of communism? Well, I've actually done quite a lot of talking about that before. Again, episode 14, but you don't need to watch that. The whole point of Polymath is that each episode is comprehensible by itself, but you can watch it if you'd like to. But again, there's some different ways that the economic system of communism can work. But in anarcho-communism, the economic formulation of communism is such that there is no markets, right? So a market is basically when the distribution of goods, so who gets what in a society, is based on economic rules. So for example, supply and demand. So for example, when you want to buy food, there's a market for food. The pricing of that food, your ability to access that food, is determined by economic rules. In anarcho-communism, that doesn't take place. The economy is planned. So what that basically means is that units of individuals, so different associations, different organizations, make decisions about what they are going to make and how they are going to distribute what they are going to make. Now, in different communist schools of thought, that planning can be central, i.e. done by a central authority, so centralized planning, or you can have decentralized planning, which is done by horizontal, autonomous, kind of individual associations where there's no hierarchy between them. Now, in anarcho-communism, it's always this kind of decentralized planning. Now, another key thing with anarcho-communism, the idea in anarcho-communism is that the means of production are communally owned. So it's, for example, they're not privately owned, but they're also not socially owned. So they're not just owned by the people who actually operate them. So for example, if workers work in a factory, that factory is not just owned by the workers. The entirety of society collectively owns that means of production. And there are some examples of collective ownership in modern society today. So open source software is a really classic example of this. Everyone owns it. Everyone can edit it. The information available on Wikipedia is also an example of something of collective ownership. Everyone can edit it. Everyone can access it. It belongs to everyone. So it's not like a completely foreign concept. And the idea is that in anarcho-communism, there is a collective possession of any product of labor, any means of production, labor, land, capital. It's all collectively owned. Personal property is not collectively owned. So you're not sharing your toothbrush. But the idea is that the things which are needed for the economy are collectively owned. Another thing in anarcho-communism, there's no wage labor at all. There's also no money per se. There's no markets. There's a complete abolition of market forces. These individual units determine what gets made and how what gets made gets distributed for the good of the community. And the key thing here is that each person receives goods according to their needs, not their deeds. So basically these horizontal individual units produce X number of goods, and individuals can freely choose how many goods or what goods or how much of each goods they take from that communal stockpile. And obviously there's no laws around this. It can still be regulated, for example, by social dynamics. So for example, shunning or ostracization of individuals who are too greedy. Again, it is a criticism to levy. We do know that greed is an inherent human capacity. So there would have to be mechanisms to regulate greed. It's not impossible that social dynamics could do it. But again, it depends on the context. It depends whether these dynamics are strong enough. It depends what the consequences for violation of these social sanctions would be, etc., etc., etc. The idea is that resource allocation is not done by the market. It's done by individuals for the good of people, so that no one is left starving, no one is left needy, no one is left desperate or in poverty, etc., etc. And that resource allocation is done on the basis of how scarce that good is and how useful that good is. So the value of goods in anarcho-communism, and indeed in communist economics in general, comes from use value, not exchange value. So how useful a good is to people, not how much that good can be exchanged for. And by the way, use values can be positive, so how well, what utility does it grant people, and use values can also be negative. So for example, a negative use value is the amount of resources consumed to make something, the amount of pollution caused by it, the amount of labor taken up to kind of created, etc., etc., etc. So anarcho-communism, it's a form of anarchist economics. And again, it's decentralized. But again, so that's the furthest left element of economics. So on that economic leftism, economic rightism spectrum, the far pole of that is for either centralized planning or decentralized planning. I mean, you could even argue that they're as left-wing as each other. I think I would personally say that decentralized planning is probably more left-wing, simply because it's even less. But it's not really a regulatory issue. I mean, I think I would probably say it just seems to me to be more left-wing because it's associated with more left-wing philosophies. For example, that's associated with anarchism, or with centralized planning is more associated with communism. Or rather, communism can be associated with both centralized and decentralized planning, but anarchism is exclusively associated with decentralized planning. Anarchism is more left-wing than communism. So it may make intuitive sense to me to put decentralized planning further left on that axis than centralized planning. But again, there's no real basis for that. I mean, you could easily argue that they're both as economically left-wing as each other based on the degree of regulation of the economy. And as you can see in both of these forms of planning, there's an ultimate form of regulation in the economy, because the economy, there isn't even any markets. It's all planned by individuals. So again, our other variants. So anarcho-collectivism, it's another school of thought. And it's also this kind of communal ownership of the means of production. So everyone owns the means of production. And however, the key difference between anarcho-collectivism and anarcho-communism is that even though there's still a decentralized planning, it's instead of to each according to their needs, in anarcho-collectivism, the philosophy is to each according to their deeds. So there's that sense of proportionality. You get out what you put in. So wage labor still exists. There is still some kind of reward for labor, whether that's money per se, or whether that's like labor vouchers, so some kind of certificate that marks how much labor you've put in. So it's not really based on markets, but there is still distribution by deeds in the sense that you're rewarded in some sense for the work that you put in. So even if that wage labor, it's not coming to you from an employer, you're not getting these wages or labor out of an employer, they're rather allocated by the community, by the association as a whole. So collectivism is this kind of halfway house between communism or anarcho-communism and another school of thought called mutualism. So mutualism is actually a form of market socialism. So what does that mean? So by the way, actually, we do talk about socialism because of course we fucking do. We yap about everything in Polymath, but we do talk about socialism in episode 12 of Polymath. But the idea is that you still have markets. So you still have distribution determined by the rules of supply and demand. Markets does not imply capitalism, because markets aren't just what define capitalism. Markets are an essential component of capitalism, but in capitalism you have markets and private property, and also, of course, wage labor. So in mutualism, you still have markets, but it's market socialism. So you essentially have the producers of commodities. So for example, let's say you have a bunch of workers in a factory. That factory is owned by the workers as a cooperative. They're entitled to the fruits of their own labor. There's no one ruling over them. There's no one taking the profits of their labor. They own that factory collectively. And based on the productivity of that factory, they gain the profit, I suppose. They gain the rewards of that productivity. It's theirs. So the means of production, this is called the means of production being socially owned. They're not collectively owned, because let's say you have a factory with a bunch of workers working in it. The workers are entitled to the profit of that factory. But again, the idea is that the factories wouldn't really be operated for profit, and the profit would be plowed back into the community. It wouldn't be hoarded by the workers, which is why I was kind of hesitant to use the word profit there. But the idea is that the means of production in that case are not owned by the entirety of society. They are not collectively owned. They are socially owned. It's different. But they are still operated for social good rather than profit. So for example, if factories making clothes, those clothes are made for the social good. So they're made, for example, to help everyone in society have access to clothes. They are not, the purpose of that means of production is not for the profit of the individuals who have it. Of who own it, rather. And again, things are all made for use value. So there's still ownership of the means of production, but there isn't a profit motive. There's still no state. So you still have the socio-cultural and political philosophy of anarchism. There's still no state. There's no centralization. It's still a decentralized economy. And another thing that you have, by the way, in mutualism is like the idea of free credit. So there's like this kind of a people's bank, if you will. There's still a banking organization, but it's owned by everyone. It's collectively owned, and it charges interest rates which are basically near 0%. The idea is that individuals have an access to credit. Most anarchists are not mutualists anymore. So mutualism was actually the first school of anarchism, and it's associated with this guy, Proudhon, which I mentioned earlier. Proudhon, I mean, you'll remember my quotes from Proudhon. Well, you might remember my quotes about Proudhon, I don't know. But he was viciously attacking wage labor earlier. Presumably the wage labor he advocates under mutualism would be of a very different kind than the wage labor under capitalism, so he wouldn't be so vastly against it. And also anarcho-syndicalism. So anarcho-syndicalism, it's kind of its own economic idea, but it's also seen as like a tactic to reach another goal. So anarcho-communism or anarcho-collectivism or mutualism. So anarcho-syndicalism is basically when these voluntary associations that I've been talking about this whole time, those are labor unions. So it is that the trade unions form the basis of that anarchist society and the basis of the economy. But again, whether the economy is conducted in an anarcho-communist or anarcho-connectivist or mutualist way is up to debate. Anarcho-syndicalism does not prescribe a specific goal here. The whole point of anarcho-syndicalism is that the motive force for reaching goals is through the trade union. And of course, in that trade union or labor union, these would all be completely democratic, self-managing, and hierarchical. So that's a kind of overview of how the economy would work in anarchism. And there's various other sort of theories and different kind of concepts that evolve in anarchist economics. Things like the labor theory of value, the energy theory of value. I'm not going to go into all of the nitty-gritty of the various different theories because the conclusions of those theories have been incorporated into what I've just said. So you still get a kind of gist of anarchist economics and an understanding of what it is, even if I'm not outlining all the original, the individual constituents, the individual theoretical constituents of anarchist economics. I think an important thing I will mention is this idea of a gift economy. So an anarcho-communist, I kind of mentioned this earlier, not so much with mutualists and less so with anarcho-collectivists, because anarcho-collectivists, again, it's this kind of halfway house between communism and mutualism, but anarcho-communists classically advocate this thing called the gift economy. And the idea of a gift economy is that it's based on this kind of, because everyone owns everything collectively, it's based on this kind of free distribution of goods and services. The idea is that it's an economic system rather than things being traded per se, goods and services are kind of given to each other, and there's this social expectation of reciprocity. But because in anarcho-communism there's no money, there's no markets, there's no laws, there's no contracts, the economy necessarily has to be a gift economy. So products are given away and they're freely distributed. And the idea is that gift economies can be planned economies. There can't be no planning at all. So in an anarcho-communist system, for example, you can theoretically have no planned economy at all. So no decentralized planning, just a gift economy. I think in practice, anarchist theory tends to emphasize the idea of decentralized planning, kind of incorporating the tenets of a gift economy as well. And the idea is that things are just communally shared with each other. And this has happened historically. So hunter-gatherer societies classically operate by gift economies. So in hunter-gatherer societies, there is no money, there's no market, there's no bartering. Gift economies can coexist with planned economies. They can coexist with market economies. They can even coexist with barter economies. But in a hunter-gatherer society, for example, it's just a gift economy. And hunter-gatherers do genuinely share things with each other, even though they do have personal property. But there is such thing as a gift economy in hunter-gatherer societies rather. And that's mediated by social dynamics. So there's an expectation of reciprocity and social consequences. For example, reductions in social acceptance or social status, or even ostracization if those expectations aren't met. And you can also, for example, a challenge to a fight can be a social consequence mediated by failures to reciprocate in this idea of a gift economy. So again, that's just another important concept to cover. So, we've explored the economic and political components of the ideology of anarchism. Let's look at the socio-cultural component of anarchism. What do anarchists believe and what do they value? We're going to get on the issue of specific stances taken on social views, but I think what's very fundamental to talk about anarchism is its relation to something called liberalism. Now, we talk about liberalism a lot in Polymath. Liberalism is a very classic reoccurring theme in this whole series. So if you're a long time viewer of Polymath and you hear me say the word liberalism, you might be thinking like, fucking come on, he finally said it. I knew he was going to say it. And you're right, I did. You're right, hypothetical viewer, I did say it. But the point is that it's just, liberalism is something that's very, very relevant to modern society, very relevant to human history in general. Now, the word liberal is classically used in Western parlance to determine a left-wing Westerner. That is not what liberalism is. What is liberalism? Liberalism is essentially a set of beliefs which we now take for granted in the modern Western world. It is the set of beliefs including that people who are in a state should consent to be governed by that state. It is the belief that violence is not an inherently good thing and you need to be justified in order to use violence. It is the idea that in an ideal state, all the citizens are happy, not all the citizens are blindly obedient. It is the idea that people have rights and that these rights should not be violated. It is the idea that freedom and equality, these two values, are fundamentally good things. Now, since the beginning of human civilization, the 4th millennium BCE, up until the 1700s, this was not the case. the values underpinning civilization, the things which people aimed for, were not freedom and equality. They were authority and obedience. And the result was rigidly hierarchical and very oppressive societies, where the vast majority of people were basically screwed over in lots of colourful ways on a daily basis. More information on that in episode 9 of Polymath, which talks about the definition of liberalism, and is also the introduction to this whole series of an objective guide to political ideologies. Now, here's the thing. In the long 19th century, which is this historiographical period spanning from the French Revolution to the onset of World War I, so that's 1789 to 1914, in the long 19th century, liberal democracy gradually became accepted in the West. And this was liberal democracy allied to a capitalistic system. So the idea here in liberal capitalist democracy is that the system of capitalism is sufficient to achieve these aims: freedom, equality, and individualism. That's another key thing. Before liberalism, people were conceptualized as members of a specific social class. And if you were a person who was in a lower social class, for example, if you were a peasant, then because peasants didn't matter, you didn't matter. You had, as a peasant, no individual rights or any individual value. Your happiness did not matter. So when we talk about individualism now in the Western context, it tends to be in a pejorative way. We tend to talk about individualism going too far. And that is very much valid. Individualism can go too far. But individualism in the context of liberalism is the acknowledgement that people should not just be identified as members of a social class. People are inherently valuable and they should be treated as such, and their happiness should matter. So liberal democratic capitalism says, listen, we acknowledge freedom, equality, and individualism as good things, but we see capitalism as sufficient to bring about these values. And the whole socialist movement, all these currents of socialism, communism, anarchism, they basically say, no, that's not sufficient. Capitalism cannot bring about these needs. And liberalism in the classical sense, so liberalism in the sense in which it was devised in the 1700s, although liberalism has antecedents in the 1600s, for example, in Western Europe, but liberalism in the sense that it was originally devised was all about private property and markets and free labor, etc., etc., etc. So anyone in the socialist movement obviously disagrees with this. There is this divergence with classical liberalism. But the point is that the whole socialist movement emerges from that ideological wellspring. It comes from that origin of liberalism. Because all of these people, socialists, communists, anarchists, they all fundamentally, even liberal democratic capitalists, they all fundamentally believe violence is not inherently good and its use needs to be justified. They all believe that freedom, equality, and individualism are inherently good things. They just disagree on the means needed to get there. And they just disagree on what degree of freedom, equality, and individualism are sufficient. And the reason why anarchism is a far left ideology is because it takes the most radical definition of what is needed to grant people freedom, equality, and individualism. But make no mistake, that is the point of anarchism. That is what anarchists want. Another thing that's important, when we talk about leftism and rightism, as I mentioned before, there are different moral values associated with each of these sides of the political spectrum. So leftism tends to be associated with the values of freedom. It values freedom. Equality, it values equality. Liberty, well, that's of course freedom. And also empathy, so concern for other people's suffering. Rightist values tend to be authority, order, duty, tradition, hierarchy, etc. Anarchism, so in the socio-cultural component of anarchism, is one that is a hyper-progressive ideology. On that progressivism, conservatism axis, it's on the far progressive end. It's on the far left end. And as you can imagine, the value system of anarchism and of anarchists is fundamentally all about those leftist values that I mentioned, and it's fundamentally about the repudiation of all those right-wing values. It rejects authority, it rejects tradition, it rejects the notion of duty, it rejects the notion of hierarchy. In terms of order, anarchists don't advocate for chaos, they don't advocate for the law of the jungle, but they argue that order can be maintained without authority. It can be maintained without a government. That is the key essence of anarchism. And of course, as you can imagine, on specific social issues, for example, race, gender, LGBT identities, homosexuals, feminism, etc., anarchists have always taken the most progressive stances regardless of era. Feminism, for example. So in the 1800s, I mean, this is an era where women I mean, like, where women were depressed, they'd go to doctors and be diagnosed with hysteria, where they could barely own property, where some of them couldn't even get married, where they couldn't work. So you're a woman, you get married, then you stay confined in a home all day, and if your husband abuses you, domestic abuse isn't even a crime, so it's legal. If your husband rapes you, marital rape isn't even a crime, so it's all legal. There's a massive inbuilt gender inequality, a patriarchy in historical Western society. And there's lots of debate on whether patriarchy actually exists. Nowadays in Western society, the evidence is that it does, which you can deny or not believe. That is your prerogative. The point is that it is. But it's much less deniable in the 1800s, for example, when basic civil rights were not granted to women, and anarchists consistently argued not just for civil rights and legal rights to be granted for women, but also in a cultural sense, for women to be taken as seriously as men and to be granted equality with men. So the First International, this kind of international left-wing socialist, social democratic, communist, anarchist association that was founded in 1864, that was the only major political institution at the time which accepted women as its members. Although, in fairness, even then, there was only one female member of the First International, to my knowledge. So again, even then, anarchists in the 1800s were not as progressive as anarchists now, of course, but the idea is that relative to the standards of their time, anarchists have always been very, very progressive. And I've used feminism as an example. It also applies to issues of race, issues of gender, also issues of free love, the idea of so anarchists, especially in this period of time from around the turn of the 20th century, so around 1890 to 1920, there was this big anarchist tendency of free love. So no marriage, because at the time, of course, marriage meant authority of the husband over the wife and a legal subordination of the wife to the husband. It survives in a tendency of current anarchist currents to sort of back polyamory a bit more. There was also another kind of big form of a very progressive stance taken by anarchists on education. So the idea of education in anarchists is that the whole point of education is it's to make an individual a confident, good, happy person. The idea is that there's a lot of respect for child autonomy. There's lots of respect for teaching child critical thinking and reasoning rather than rote learning and indoctrination. The idea is that children shouldn't be subject to rigid discipline. They should be taught with a sense of love and rationality. The idea is that they should be sort of not manipulated or indoctrinated in any way. Although there's kind of a disagreement in anarchists on what constitutes indoctrination and manipulation. So some anarchists, for example, this Catalan anarchist called Francisco Ferrer, believe that you had to tell pupils that equality and liberty and social justice weren't possible under capitalism. And he also believed that you should also critique government and nationalism in other ways as well. But again, there's debate on that. Some capitalists would say that you can't do that. You cannot introduce any kind of indoctrination at all. And the idea is that, again, respect for the child is key. And the idea is that you're meant to develop the child into a well-functioning, stable individual. But of course, there's lots of sort of newer currents of anarchism. So what we mentioned before, there's lots of schools of anarchism, lots of different hyphenations of anarchism. For example, anarcho-feminism or green anarchism, all of which are known for emphasizing the progressive stances taken by anarchists on various political issues. But the idea is that anarchism, as a hyper-progressive ideology, consistently takes very progressive stances on social issues, and consistently has done so. So that's the kind of socio-cultural component of anarchism. So all of this begs the question, all of this 1 hour and 40 minutes, Jesus Christ, a lot of yapping, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of yapping. But good yapping, of course, a benevolent yapping, I must say. All this benevolent yapping on anarchism really leads us to the question, has this ever actually happened? Because similarly with communism, I mean, I talked earlier about how you have this massive divergence between what communism was envisioned as being, the formulation of communism in the 1800s, and the implementation of communism in the 1900s. The two are very wildly different from each other. And I talk about that more, of course, in episode 14, which, you might want to check out my other content. I actually have a podcast. It's called Polymath, and episode 14 talks about communism. I hate to shamelessly plug myself over and over again. But again, anarchism and communism, they are often compared to each other, they're often contrasted to each other. Having an understanding of communism really, really helps. But it's not necessary. It's not necessary. Again, you don't need to watch any of my other episodes of Polymath to understand this one. So, anarchism. Has all of this ever come close to actually occurring? Well, I'm glad you asked, because it actually kind of did. So during the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939, anarchism actually occurred in parts of Spain. So especially in the region of Catalonia, it was led by this organization called the CNT, and it was a kind of anarcho-syndicalist formulation of anarchism. Remember how there are lots of different flavors of anarchism, which I talked about earlier. It was anarcho-syndicalist, and it was especially seen in Catalonia. And it was a kind of society was organized in communes. Spanish society at the time was mostly rural. And the communes under anarchism actually produced more than they did beforehand. So up to 50% more goods were produced by these communes than beforehand. Multiple sources said that industrial productivity increased as well. The central government itself admitted that Catalonia produced 10 times more than all other Spanish industry put together. That is, of course, due to a pre-existing concentration of industry in Catalonia. But the idea is that industry didn't collapse under the implementation of anarchism, and under the CNT, which set up this kind of series of horizontal autonomous democratic associations. You have lots of progressive ideas such as the right to abortion implemented, a volunteer police, consensual free love, so no marriage, so no legal or state intervention in sexuality. All the workers were given arms as well. This was in the midst of a civil war, and the nationalists in the civil war, both sides, the nationalists and the Republicans, did not behave stupendously during the Civil War, you could say. It is worth noting, and this is the pattern that we see that you can see in other civil wars as well, such as the Finnish Civil War. Whilst atrocities occurred on both sides, the scale of atrocities was much higher by the right-wing forces. So, for example, Franco's White Terror killed multiple times as the Republican Red Terror. Same in the Finnish Civil War. The whites killed around 10 times more people than the reds. Another important commonality between the two is that in both cases, the leftist side, or the reds, committed atrocities largely as a sort of breakdown of communications and chaos. Lots of wanton killing that wasn't really coordinated or ordered at all. Massacres that kind of happened by units acting autonomously. Whereas by the right-wing side, or the whites, these kind of atrocities were systematic campaigns of terrorists which were deliberately ordered from above. They were deliberate maneuvers, and they were organized and they were approved by right-wing authorities. So in the case of Franco Spain, the nationalist rebel authorities. So of course in the Spanish Civil War, it's a very difficult time for anyone to be implementing anarchism. It was a very fraught and chaotic and violent atmosphere. Now in the later stage of the Civil War, what actually happened eventually was that in the Republican faction of the Civil War, Marxist-Leninists gained more influence and power gradually. And Marxism-Leninism is the specific ideology of communism that we see in 20th century communist states like the Soviet Union. So it's Marxism-Leninism, despite the name, is very, very different from what Marx wanted, because the Soviet Union was fundamentally a very authoritarian state. Karl Marx was all about the establishment of democracy through bottom-up processes, i.e. of the people spontaneously seizing control of society and spontaneously creating voluntary associations and using them to seize control of the society. Marx envisioned a society where individuals were free and equal and could be individuals. The USSR, under the philosophy of Marxism-Leninism, a term coined by Stalin, was anything but that. But the Marxist-Leninists, i.e. the people who followed this philosophy as seen in the Soviet Union, eventually gained more and more influence on the Republican side. They re-established authoritarian measures like a police force. Then they took the arms away from the workers. They then gave them to a new regular army. And there was this very big kind of violent confrontation between the anarchists and the Marxist-Leninists in what is known as the May Days in 1937. And the Marxist-Leninists seized power. Eventually, Franco won the war and very brutally crushed the Republican side with lots of politicide and mass killings. Although there was some kind of guerrilla war in a small scale which persisted until around 1960, by which basically in a process of the Francoist dictatorship very brutally rooting them out. A kind of brief state of anarchism kind of also arguably existed in the early stages of the Russian Revolution. So the USSR stands for Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. I already said this previously in the video, but just in case you're here for the clip, I'm just going to say it again. A Soviet is just is the word for just a workers' council. And initially in the early stages of the Russian Revolution, these councils were there were regions in which these councils exercised horizontal power. I wouldn't really call the early stages of the Russian Revolution anarchist, although there were kind of some anarchist elements there. Of course, eventually the Bolsheviks centralized power within their party and suppressed all the power of the Soviets. There was also some anarchist tomfoolery, just in some protests in Argentina around the turn of the 21st century. But again, nothing the Spanish Civil War was the only time in which actual anarchist regions, an anarchist kind of, not a state, but anarchist polities were created. It was just in the Russian Revolution, the Argentinian turn of the century, we saw kind of anarchist tendencies in certain stages, in certain areas of the discord. So, that is today's episode. I think that's the longest episode I've ever done. I think this is even longer than the communism episode. And that makes sense because there's just so much to say. There's so much to talk about with anarchism. It's such a massive topic, and it really deserves, considering how emotionally evocative it is, it deserves much more attention than it really has. I hope that I've done this vast and complex and messy topic justice today. And if you are still watching, ladies and gentlemen, I am sincerely grateful for your time. It really means a lot to me, especially if you've watched all the fucking way to the end of the episode. If you've watched this nearly 2-hour episode, but even if you haven't, even if you just tuned in for a couple minutes, even just for a few seconds, even if you just clicked on the video and immediately fucked off, I am still grateful for that process of fucking off, because it means that you listened, that you cared, even if it was just for a second, and I'm very, very grateful for your time and your patience and your energy. So, I hope you all have a lovely, lovely day or night or whatever kind of circadian period you prefer, and I will see you next week. Have a lovely, lovely day. Ta-da!